Good evening, everyone. Pastor Greg here. It is Wednesday night, February 17th, 2021, and we continue on in our series called God's Great Design. And just to give a quick review, that if you missed the first two that we've talked through, make sure that you watch those. If you're watching or listening to these out of order, some things might make sense, but a lot of things will not make sense. So make sure that you're going through these in order, or if you're watching tonight and haven't seen a previous one, make sure you go back. Your leader can help you know where to find it so that way you can see the progression of the principles that the Holy Spirit's put upon me to want to make sure that we understand as we progress through this topic. And I also am very, very pleased to hear from all of the group leaders that more conversation is happening. That as we maybe get over the initial hurdle of not being familiar with each other, talking about this topic, that we get past it to the point of what does God want? What does His Word really say? So that way we can engage in a very mature way with this topic of how we're going to use our bodies, our identity, our sexuality, and sex, and what God has for us in a world that is horribly messed up and is aggressively coming after you more than our generation as the leaders, with the opposite of what God's design is. And so we feel for you, and that's why we want to make sure that you know what the truth of God is when it comes to these things. So by a quick review, with lesson number one, the three principles that we talked about was that circle. Remember the biggest circle that you can think of, and everything within that circle is what's available for you to do. It's a choice for you to be able to do. But in the middle represents the exact center of God's love, His will, His plan, His way of righteousness. And so when we think about all the decisions that we could make, all the things that we could do, how are we getting to the middle of the circle versus getting as far away from the middle of the circle as possible and still think that we're okay in our own mind? We cannot replace or exchange the truth of God for anything under any circumstances at all. And the second thing we talked about was that recipe. We can't mess with God's recipe for His blessing for us, for His freedom when it comes to our sexuality, which He made good. When it comes to sex, which He has a design for that. There's a recipe that God has to make sure that we have that. And then we talked thirdly about the covenant and the powerful symbolism behind the covenant, and that within the blessing of marriage between a man and a woman, the covenant comes into play when it comes to that relationship and the sex that God allows and blesses and calls good and commands for that to happen within marriage. And then last week we were talking about the idea behind, gender. That without question, the truth of God is there are two genders. There's nothing else that can be said or argued, from Scripture. And so to deviate away from that goes against what God's plan is, His truth is. At the same time, we understand that we live in a fallen and messed up world. Therefore, there's going to be confusion. There's going to be questions. There's going to be, as people develop and mature, questions about things because of the fall. And we have to understand that asking questions is okay. Finding out information about what you think and feel is okay. But just because you feel a certain way does not change your DNA. It does not change the sacredness of God in you that He made. There's a set apartness about you and your gender and how He made things. And so that was the biggest idea behind last week. Also understanding that our bodies are not ours. Our soul lives in this temporary human being, flesh and blood, for a little while. We are managers. We are stewards of somebody else's property because this belongs to God. And so that brings us to tonight with lesson 3. So we're talking about your sexuality. There should be a supplemental sheet that I don't have with me right now that your leader will be giving to you tonight to make sure that you have to keep these key principles in front of us throughout the entire series, something for you to have with you for the rest of your life, because I know that you're going to keep that for the rest of your life. But I want you to have more tools in your hands, that as you're learning and discussing, that you have these things accessible to you all the time. But so tonight, talking about your sexuality, because I'm not sure what kind of upbringing that you've had. I know the upbringing that I've had, of course, and the idea of God creating your sexuality as good is something that for a while for me seemed kind of weird. But when God calls it very good, when He created Adam and Eve naked, and they said they felt no shame until the fall came and everything, there was nothing wrong at all with how God made you and your sexuality. And when defining that as your natural desires, your physical attributes, how your body grows and develops, your mental, your thoughts, how your brain functions, what you're attracted to, how your body responds to what you're attracted to. All of that is something natural and very, very good and designed by God. And if there's not something going on with a natural sexual desire, which is an expression of your sexuality, there's probably something wrong going on. So I don't want you to ever feel like there's something wrong with me because, man, when I see that guy, when I see that girl, or when I look at this, when I see that like my body responds and like what's going on. That is a natural and good thing that God has built into us as long as we keep according to his plan, keep according to his purpose, and we don't get into the world of lust and taking and making it perverted and dirty versus appreciating how God made us and every part of us that is so good. And so I don't want you to ever think from me that I'm saying that God has a plan for sex because sex is bad and sex is wrong. And unfortunately, when you get married, if you want to have a child, you're going to have sex, but it just quick and get it over with and never talk about it or think about it again. That is not at all what I want to say. I want to make sure that you don't understand that God has blessed it. He's called for it to be something that is a healthy part of a marriage relationship between the man and a woman. And so for you to be thinking and responding and reacting and questioning what the world's going on with me, that is natural and normal and needs to happen. And that's why we have your small group leaders, your small group. That's why we have the church to support in addition to your parents, which you should be talking to and asking questions about this stuff. Make sure that you have that because your sexuality is something to be celebrated. God gave it to you. There's nothing wrong or dirty about it if we keep it the way that he has designed things to be. And so everything about how you work and respond, that is blessed by God. Another part that I want to say is, guys, it is important for you, for the boys, to understand how girls work, how they think, how they respond to sexual things, so that way we can honor how God made them and not do things to cause temptation or lustful thoughts or to feed into anything that's unhealthy versus praising and understanding how God made everything and honoring the opposite gender that God and how God made women. And for the girls, the same thing with guys. To understand as much as you can about how their sexuality works, how their bodies and their minds and all that kind of stuff react and think and respond to all the things that go on that way. So that way you can, with God's help, honor and respect and not do anything that would be a stumbling block to guys. And so we need to honor each other. There is such a beauty in this design that God has made. And therefore we need to honor each other. And so by knowing how the opposite gender works, for the most part, is going to help you understand how you can live your life honorably. A couple verses that I want to have us look at this is in Genesis 39:9 says this. This is Joseph talking after the whole accusation by Potiphar's wife. So Joseph is not great. No one is greater in this house than I am. Nor has Pharaoh, nor has he kept back anything from me except for you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? So Joseph did not want to do anything that would go against God's design. I bet you anything that Pharaoh's wife was beautiful. And as a guy, to have a woman throwing themselves at you, that is very, very flattering. And it's very easy to fall into the temptation of doing whatever physically and sexually in that situation. But Joseph said, no, it was not, because I don't want to sin against you or Pharaoh. I don't want to sin against God. I want to honor my design and honor your design and not do this terrible thing. In Psalm 101, 1-4, it says this, I will sing of steadfast love and justice to you, O Lord. I will make music. I will ponder the way that is blameless. Oh, when will you come to me? I will walk with integrity within my house. I will not I will not set before my eyes anything that is worthless. I hate the work of those who fall away. It will not cling to me. A perverse heart shall be far from me. I will know nothing of evil. And so that's where David is, in all the mess that he went on in his life, it was something that he purposed in his heart. Like, I don't want to do this. I'm going to set something as a guard before my eyes. I don't want to set evil things before my eyes, because when he did that on the roof looking down at Bathsheba who was bathing, that we all know the rest of that story, and there were horrible consequences for that. Last verse in this section here, 1 Corinthians 6:18, flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits outside the body, but the sexual immoral person sins against his own body. And so guys, those are a couple verses of many to look at understanding and celebrating within the proper context of how God made your sexuality. The second thing under this lesson that I want to make sure we understand is that God created sex. He blessed sex. He wanted married people to have a lot of sex and not be stupid about it, not be a jerk about it, but to have that be something that is a normal part built into marriage to again, honor each other and the needs and the desires and the coming together of intimacy as one of the ways of coming together in an intimate way. Because you can have intimacy with another person without there being any kind of sex or expression of your sexuality in that. But in marriage, that adds to what the intimacy piece is that God has. Because remember the whole covenant symbolism piece? So it was God's idea. He commanded it. He blessed it. And we need to look at it that way. I want you to look at a couple verses. Genesis 1:28 says this, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, is what God told them. That was, have sex. Be fruitful and multiply. And not just for procreation, but that is one of the things that God blessed them. Look at Proverbs 5:15 through 20, which is a description of sex within marriage. It's not Song of Solomon, which can get into some like weird poetry and symbolism and talk, and you're reading it kind of like, what in the world are you talking about? But it's talking about within the covenant of marriage between a man and a woman and all that is Proverbs 5:15 through 20. Drink water from your own cistern. That means like drink water from your own well, or be engaged in sexual activity with your own wife. Nobody else's, but your wife. Flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth. A lovely deer, a graceful doe, let her breasts fill you at times with delight, be intoxicated always with her love. So that is weird poetry. Guys, I don't recommend that. Girls, I don't recommend that you tweak that to give to guys here in 2021. But back then, that was poetry that a husband was talking about, his wife, and God telling us that this is so special between a husband and a wife to enjoy that part of marriage and have there be nothing at all wrong with that ever. I forgot verse 20. Why should you be intoxicated, my son, with a forbidden woman and embrace the bosom of an adulteress? And then 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 5 says this. Now regarding the questions you asked in your letter, yes, it is good to abstain from sexual relations. This is within marriage. But because there is so much sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman should have her own husband. The husband should fulfill his wife's sexual needs, and the wife should fulfill her husband's needs. The wife gives authority over her body to her husband, and the husband gives authority over his body to his wife. Do not deprive or do not withhold from each other. Do not deprive each other of sexual relations unless you both agree to refrain from sexual intimacy for a limited time so that you can give yourselves more completely to prayer. Afterward, you should come together again so that Satan won't be able to tempt you because of your lack of self-control. And so what Paul's saying in 1 Corinthians 7 and 1 Corinthians 6 and 7 talks a lot about this. What God is saying through Paul is, as a husband and a wife, you should be having a lot of sex. And to abstain from that or to refrain for a while is to be, agreed upon by the husband and a wife, again, in a perfect and ideal situation, but for the sake of prayer and fasting. So God is basically saying, my relationship is still more important than yours with your wife or with your husband. And therefore, to focus on me in times of prayer and fasting, don't become distracted by sex, even with your spouse, because I want you to focus on me, but for a limited amount of time, but go back to engaging in sexual sex with your husband or wife, because Satan is going to otherwise tempt you and connive and draw you away from that. And so that's a kind of seems again kind of weird, but that is directly from God through Paul in 1 Corinthians 7. One thing I want to say real quick is that when we're talking about marriage, I'm not talking about because it's come up before, because I've been in ministry where some people will get close to being married. And they're like, well, we're basically married anyway. We're going to get married, so why can't we have sex? Why can't we live together? Why can't we do all these things? Because, guys, when we're talking about marriage, we're talking about where there is remember, the covenant is involved. So there is a public spiritual ceremony of what goes on. It's recognized by family. It's recognized by a pastor or a clergy of the church, or it's recognized by a justice of the peace, or a judge, whatever it might be, depending on the legality of things. There is a legal binding covenant within the state that you get married in here in the United States, But there's also that spiritual covenant symbolized in the ceremony and the coming together of marriage. So we're not talking about two people who say, what's the big deal? A marriage certificate, just a piece of paper. We're already married anyway. No. We cannot allow anybody to think that way at all. It has to come from the specialness of the ceremony that's recognized, and there's prayer involved. There's vows being made to each other that symbolizes the covenant of God. That's what we're talking about within marriage. So I want to make sure that that part is crystal clear. God calls the marriage bed undefiled. Another word for that would be pure or set apart. So even what God is saying, within your sexuality, there is a sacredness in the design, a set apartness to God. And sex within marriage is also that there's a purity to it. There's nothing wrong with it at all. To that, again, it might seem kind of weird to you, like how there's God's involved in sex between a husband and a wife. The sacredness based on the covenant, the ceremony, and how God is brought into that relationship. There was something for sure within there where the marriage bed, sex within marriage, is undefiled. It's not corrupt. It's not unnatural. It has everything of God's blessing in there. It's the symbolic of that. And also to make sure we understand that sex is for a lot more than procreation. God gave it to husband and wife to enjoy. God is promised, I want to give this to you to enjoy. But again, I have the center of my circle of that design. I have the recipe that I want to give you that provides freedom and openness and the ability to not have, guilt and all the baggage that can come with that, because I want you to enjoy it. Yes, it's how kids are born, and I want to make sure that you have that also going on. And then there's no other sexual union, guys, designed or blessed by God other than a husband male, wife female within the covenant of marriage. Again, as I said at the beginning, you have messages coming after you in an aggressive and powerful way that you have to accept every other expression of sexuality. Sex is just, love is love, and it doesn't matter who it is or when it is or what it is. And you are being forced more than at any other time in history to not just accept, but to promote and embrace that as truth. And that is not the truth. It is replacing and exchanging the truth of God for things that are not right at all. And therefore, you need to stand firm. You can still love somebody and not agree with what they're choosing to do. You can direct attention to, look, I'm trying to follow God with my life, and I know this is what God says, and He's not going to bless any other way except for following His design, following His recipe, understanding the covenant is involved, and all of that kind of stuff. Another thing before we get into or continue on is the idea of being single versus being married. And so what I also don't want to communicate that if you are married, it's better than if you are single. Or if you are single, it's better than if you are married. Paul talks a lot about being single. And it can appear to come as there's a huge advantage to being single. There's nothing wrong with you or nothing wrong with a person if they're single. There is more of a freedom to serve God and to go and to be a lot more flexible if you are single than if you are married. Because Paul goes on to say, look in 1 Corinthians 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, if you reread that if you're married, now you are responsible for somebody else, the cares of somebody else. There's so much more going on. And if you have children, there are things that you have to have responsibility over versus being single. So what I don't want to communicate at all is that if you are single, there's something wrong, there's something messed up, you are less of a person than if you are married or not, depending on your age. Like, it doesn't matter. Because Paul gives a lot of compliments to people who are able to be single and stay single and serve him while being what's called celibate, while not engaging in expressing their sexuality through sex, because there's an understanding of, I am more concerned about pleasing God than fulfilling my sexual desire as a single person. Whereas in marriage, that changes things and it's different. So I want to make sure, and what I recommend to you guys as teenagers is stay single. Don't get yourself locked into dating. Put the drama aside. Be friends with a lot of different people. Learn how a variety of guys work. See how relationships work together. Be friends in groups. And when we get back to be doing things in groups, of course, but don't get yourself locked into dating. What I will say is I don't recommend that you date one-on-one until you're at least a senior in high school and your parents are involved, that they know what's going on, that there's a spiritual health to the direction of what's going on. Because once you start dating, it changes so much of your mind. You put yourself in opportunities where your sexuality can be aroused by being around each other, excuse me, and being alone. And it just creates all kinds of weird temptations and things that you probably aren't ready for yet. So honor God by honoring his design, understanding and celebrating your sexuality, but stay single. I honor people who are single. So I want to make sure that we address that a little bit as well. Obviously, God is blessed and celebrated, and we get to rejoice that he has given the recipe for sex to be within marriage. Therefore, if there is a right, then there also is a wrong when it comes to sex. And so all other sexual activity, and not just sex. What I'm talking about is if you're looking at pornography, if you're messing around with a guy or girl and you're getting sexually aroused, that's sexual activity. You're doing that on purpose. You're going after that. You're looking at that. You're being with her. You're being with him on purpose because you know your body's going to respond in a sexual way. That's what I'm referring to as sexual activity, and that is also wrong. It's sinful. It goes against the design and will and blessing of God. And it doesn't matter the context. It doesn't matter what a popular opinion is. It doesn't matter what kind of a judge's decision is made or a president's decision is made. There is a wonderfulness to sex, but where we get messed up is where lust gets involved, where I want to replace God's center to where I want my life to be. I want to be able to do whatever I want, and in my mind, I start to erode what God's purity is with sexuality and sex, and lust in my mind, which then goes into my heart, and it goes from, look, I like that, I appreciate that, to I want that, to I need that, to where I'm going to take that. And guys, lust messes things up tremendously. And so if there is a right and a blessing by God in sex, there also is a wrong where everything else. So any type of homosexuality is completely non-refutable, that it is wrong according to God and his word. Fornication, which is sexual activity or sex before marriage, and adultery, being defined as sexual activity as a married person with somebody who is not your husband or not your wife, they are sinful. They are a misuse of God's design for your sexuality and the expression of sex. And pornography is involved in that. Guys, it is so important that we have this going on, that we want to honor God more than we want to fulfill ourselves. I want us to look at a couple verses. Romans 1:24-27 says this. So God abandoned them to do whatever shameful things their hearts desired. As a result, they did vile and degrading things with each other's bodies. They traded the truth of God for a lie. So they worshiped and served the things God created instead of the Creator himself, who is worthy of eternal praise. Amen. That is why God abandoned them to their shameful desires. Even the women turned against the natural way to have sex and instead indulged in sex with each other, with another woman. And the men, instead of having normal sexual relations with women, burned with lust for each other. Men did shameful things with other men. And as a result of this sin, they suffered within themselves the penalty they deserved. Look at 1 Corinthians 6:12-16 says this. You say, I am allowed to do anything, but not everything is good for me. And you even say, I am allowed to do anything, but you must not become a slave to anything. You say, food was made for the stomach and stomach for food. So what he's saying there is, your stomach is not designed for anything but food to go in and be processed and used by the body, waste product, going where all our waste products go. This is true, though someday God will do away with both of them. But you can't say that our bodies are made for sexual immorality. So, stomach for the food, food for stomach. There's no other design for it. And what God is saying is that your body is not meant for sexual immorality. Sexual immorality is there's no place for it within your body. So comparing the whole food for the stomach, you get anything besides food in your stomach, there's usually problems and sickness. They were made for God, the passage goes on to say. And the Lord cares about our bodies, and God will rise us from the dead by his power, just as he raised our Lord from the dead. And one of the 10 Commandments, Exodus 20:14, it's also repeated in Deuteronomy, you shall not commit adultery. Look at Proverbs 6:32. He who commits adultery lacks sense. He who does it destroys himself. Matthew 5:27-28. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And then two more. Romans 13:13. Let us walk properly as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and sensuality, not in quarreling and jealousy. So the idea of walking in the daytime where it's light, you're exposed to everything that's going on. It's known versus in the darkness of night and the things that are going on there. And then last verse, Galatians 5:19. Now the works of the flesh are evident: sexual immorality, impurity, and sensuality. So a wrong way of using sex. And so guys, I'm hoping that you will engage in conversation tonight about this, because God has made things so good, so wonderful. And because things are so good and so wonderful, Satan again has waged war against you. And the culture is against you, even giving any validation at all to God's design for things and the sacredness of things, the covenant that's involved in your sexuality and sex. And he is trying to get you to buy into the lie, replace the truth, exchange the truth, ask all the what if questions. Well, what about this? What about this? What about this? There's not a problem with asking the questions as long as we are seeking the center of the circle. We're seeking the center of God's will for it all, over trying to justify anything that gets us away from that center of the circle, that messes with God's recipe for his blessing, for freedom, and all of that. So guys, I love you and I care for you. I want to talk to you in a blunt way like this because there's so much that is at stake. And I don't want you to buy into the lie that Satan is trying to get you to understand and believe and go for, that there is, doesn't matter what you do with your life. It's yours. But no, you are a steward of God's body, your flesh and blood. And so I'm going to stop a lot going through this because I don't want these videos to be super long. And so have those papers to be taken with you so that you have those things, because I don't want any kind of nitty-gritty example to get lost in the overarching principles that we're trying to get applied to all of this stuff. And so again, ask questions to your leader. Engage in discussion. Don't hold back. I guarantee you somebody sitting next to you, somebody in the room is wanting you to ask questions, bold questions about, okay, what is right, what is wrong, what does God want for us all within the context of this. So guys, I love you and I care for you, and I'm so thankful that your leaders are with you tonight because they love you and care for you and know you better than I do, and that's by design. And so we want to engage in what God has for us, so go ahead and get to discussion, and I can't wait to hear about it. See you next week.